There is no definitive scholarly consensus on why men tend to hold social power over women in a majority of historic societies, although there are some compelling theories. It is likely that the real answer is a context-based mixture of many factors. But the fact is, most of us do live and have lived in a patriarchal system wherein legitimate disadvantages and systemic prejudices are placed on not just women, but various marginalised groups, and indeed various groups by the enforced social hegemony. And so often, when we design worlds of speculative fiction, these systems get grandfathered in, largely through the simple but fallacious logic of, well, that's how the world works. No, it's how our world has tended to shake out. But we should always be asking rather than assuming when inventing a new reality. How would this world work? And my conjecture is that, at least in fantasy worlds, they'd look very bloody different. Today I want to go through some of the dominant social theories about patriarchy's origin, from slightly more academic to slightly more popular theories, and to discuss why the common trappings of the fantasy world, magic, myths and monsters, imply a far more egalitarian state of affairs for the people of a fantasy realm. I'd like to start, I think, with the least academically convincing explanation of how males ended up running things, but a very popular explanation nonetheless. Biological males tend to be bigger, stronger, and faster in the human species. So obviously these people with these advantages end up in control. There may feel like there's some intuitive sense in this, but it does not explain what we see when we look at the historical record. The thing is, our intuition tells us that strength, power, and general physical prowess makes us better at hunting and fighting other people for their resources. This is essentially the invention of the warrior chief, and probably also the invention of personal property, while we're at it, that you can beat someone and own for yourself. The issue with this theory in explaining the existence and continuation of patriarchy and male dominance generally in many societies, especially fantasy ones, is that biological men don't necessarily have more power or might than biological women. It's a general truth. Firstly, we've all seen how muscly and terrifying some of the fantasy stock of female characters can be. But more seriously, it's very likely that species is a greater signifier of muscle mass and personal strength and speed than biological sex within species. Orcs tend to be bigger and stronger than humans. Elves tend to be more lithe and quick than humans, regardless of their specific biological sex. Second, magic is often considered to be a generally gender-neutral power set, unless we're in a world where only witches exist, for example. There are just too many non-gendered factors that influence one's ability to beat someone up for their stuff, from being part orc, to having access to magic, to ingesting a magical herb when ritually prepared that doubles your combat prowess. That's the small differences in normal muscle mass and muscle strength present in human sexual dimorphism are unlikely to form the entire basis of systemic prejudice in most societies in a fantasy world's history. Other factors matter far more. So, adding some complexity to our discussion here, some academic theorists suggest that the biological fact of females getting pregnant and needing to nurse newborns is a contributing factor to the origins of patriarchy. But perhaps not in the way that you might intuitively think. Yes, women tend to be incapacitated or just a little less capable than their male counterparts for long periods when they are pregnant or nursing. But it's not like all the men got together while all the women were pregnant and then decided to seize power because they couldn't fight and stop them. The fact of the matter is, everyone was being exploited by whatever elites existed in society, especially early agrarian societies, but I mean, that's not really changed now. Males were needed as able bodies to throw against your enemies in battles to protect the group's stuff, the clan stuff, and the stuff owned perhaps by the elites. While women are absolutely integral to all of this because they're able to make future women and future male soldiers. It's a little simplistic, this, but it illustrates the point well enough. The thing is, as we've already explored a little bit, in fantasy worlds it's very possible that a woman might be better at both of these different social roles, at producing children, because that tends to be their purview, and also maybe they're the holders of magic, or the passers down of magical bloodlines. But I want to go back to our world for a second, because scholars theorise that the key tipping point in our own world was when the woman's role as mother becomes enmeshed into a social expectation. From social expectation, it becomes the norm, and then the norm turns into law. At first, in these societies that needed to perpetuate themselves, women who didn't bear children were seen as weird. Later, they were seen as operating outside of normal legal systems. And later still, following the introduction of dowries as a concept, and of women as a tradable property of their own fathers and husbands, a woman refusing to be married and bear children was unprofitable, a waste, and certainly not proper, not engaged in the normal legal processes of a woman's social expected path through life. This state of affairs, this progression from unusual to borderline against the laws of nature and society, was not inevitable. Societies of bees, for example, hold some similarities to what I've discussed among early agrarian humans, except the queen bee, who produces her own defenders and soldiers, is the most important bee to be protected by the hive, unless they choose to depose her and install a new queen. To be fair, it might not be the best analogy, this, especially if you look too closely or you know anything about bees' social dynamics. But it must be said that it could have just as easily been the case that the elites in power, in control of the stuff in early agrarian societies, could have as easily cast women as the landed rock of society, responsible for owning and managing the house, while the parade of soldiers that they're able to produce fight not just for the tribe, but for the affection and hand of a powerful landowning woman. It is possible that some of these earliest elites and owners of stuff were men, perhaps achieved through a monopoly of violence, which did indeed have some small effect and may have cascaded in to a society being established by these elites, which served their interests better, perhaps. But it could have been very different. And there are numerous societies around the world where it is and was. Looking at worlds of fantasy, it may even be less likely that patriarchy takes root as the dominant form of social organisation. See, in these worlds of fantasy, hunting becomes less of a brave venturing forth to find the resources that the people of your tribe need. And hunting becomes more of a quest to find the few monsters that are actually weaker than man. When our ancient ancestors couldn't kill mammoths with their spears, they developed tactics to scare them enough to force them to run off cliffs. That sort of strategy is unlikely to work on a dragon, which I would expect to be slightly tougher than a mammoth. People in worlds of fantasy would have smaller, active ranges that they can feel safe hunting and exploring in, and would have a greater historic focus on protecting, defending, and hiding the home. If we take women's traditional role as childbirth and nurturing of young children, which would be the general expectation of most people of that biological sex in early societies, then they are far more likely to spend more time in and around the home, and more likely, therefore, to be responsible for making it safe for them and their children. It's likely to be women in these fantasy worlds who appease the mischievous household spirits, who keep the vampires out, and burn incense to keep away demonic presences. And if these women are good at these tasks, well then their home becomes materially and demonstrably safer in a world where these threats are very much out to get you. So it's actually quite likely that we would see women in positions of great power and respect, and perhaps even dominance socially, because of these specific effects. But again, there's no reason why our real world societies couldn't have gone the way of matriarchy or equality either. Women have been doing hard agricultural labour at similar rates to men since the invention of agriculture. Even today, women make up nearly half of the worldwide agricultural workforce. There's a persistent theory that suggests that with the advent of agriculture comes the ownership of personal property, and that when a concept of personal property develops, women become the property of men due to their utility in creating and nurturing a man's children to pass on said property to said children. There is no doubt that this is an active, powerful mechanism in patriarchal societies. But just like the men are big and strong and good at fighting, so they should fight to protect their property and wives and children narrative, I would suggest we're looking at these things out of order. Narratives that explain patriarchy, to some extent they exist as products of a patriarchal system. Heck, oftentimes they're justifications of the system itself. These are dominant narratives presented by societies that have already decided that the power should lie in that society's conception of masculinity. Whether that masculinity is about war, hunting, physical prowess, physical labour, or statesmanship. These are, to some extent, after-the-fact justifications of an already accepted truth. So, where does patriarchy come from, if all this is just ex post facto justification? Well, for me, the most convincing answer comes from Angela Saini. Her fascinating book, specifically diving into the origins of patriarchy, argues that there are in fact many different patriarchies, as many patriarchies as there are patriarchal societies, despite the fact that oftentimes we see these as homogenized in Western culture today. She diagnoses patriarchy's outsized presence numerically in societies around the world and throughout history as a symptom of the foundations of society itself. Essentially, a society, culture, kingdom, or clan defines itself and its people by its own values in comparison to its neighbours and its enemies. This is why there are so many distinct explanations for why men deserve to be in charge, from charisma to combat prowess, because these are the ways that different societies perceived themselves as valuable compared to others. Athens and Sparta are her most potent examples. As a multi-ethnic city-state that was in need of social cohesion to tie together especially captured women who became part of Athenian society, Athens needed a women as heir producers mentality, but they also sought to keep women in service of men to stop dangerous ideas of female empowerment infiltrating their city-states from the variety of people that they were bringing in. These dominant cultural narratives get reinforced by the way society is set up, which sees women under men in a very strict hierarchical sense. Sparta, on the other hand, had less concern with keeping a coherent society with significant foreign influx. This was not so much a reality in Sparta. Their relative insularity and obsession with warfighting does in fact lead to greater equality between the sexes, although not equality, it must be stressed. Here, women are expected to be producers of soldiers, and therefore once the children are born, they are also expected to be responsible for instilling proper Spartan values into them while their husbands may be away campaigning. To this end, Spartan women managed property. They were active in public life and were often educated. These two contemporary Greek societies were different in how patriarchy manifested in them because the needs of their cultures were fundamentally different. This affects, in a knock-on fashion, the dominant language and narratives used to discuss women's and men's specific roles. Casting Athenian women as part of the social fabric of decorum, as a part of the great glory of their husbands, and Spartan women as integral agents in producing and transmitting Spartan values into their children. So traditional gender roles can be as varied and as numerous as there are societies who need social roles and social narratives to set themselves against others. In humans, the fact of the matter is, biological sex is one of the clearest ways to delineate different groups of people, right up there alongside race. It is just the easiest shortcut to split people into different groups, to differentiate them into different jobs to be done for society, if you're looking to do that. So what can we learn from all this? First, depressingly perhaps, that our fantasy worlds just aren't prejudiced enough. There are so many more features of a person's identity in a fantasy world which can act as visual signifiers of otherness, or, depending on the social narrative that is told about them, being lesser. From species to height, from having horns to being able to use magic, all of these things may be integral to a society's social construction, and therefore be central to the specific archy that gets put in place, from magiarchy to elfiarchy. This also reveals another truth. With so many varied and intersectional forms of identity, it is kind of hard to believe that good old patriarchy becomes a mode by which the majority of fantasy societies operate. Sure, there will be some patriarchies that spring up, but they may well be equally contrasted with the variety of matriarchies, magiarchies, and also relatively egalitarian societies as well. But this isn't just a learning we can take into our fantasy speculative world building, because I keep stressing this, but it didn't have to be this way in our world either. With a few minor tweaks in exactly the right spot, history could have looked very, very different in our world. If the people who happened to be in power at the time when social mores were set for any given society were not men, for example, or not kings, or not hoarders of property or wealth, the intrinsic values of the cultures that they start building up would end up very different. We see it throughout history. The balance of power shifts, and a new social narrative of success comes to the fore. Just look at the relative elevation of the role of the white woman in the Americas, alongside the popularisation of imported slave labour, essentially bumping up the white woman a fair few pegs in the social pecking order, granting them more powers, at great expense, of course. Or for some more positive examples, the legitimising of women's suffrage in the wake of mass male deaths and women's potent contributions to the war effort in the First World War in the UK. Or the broad reform of feudal systems of indentured servitude and social reform in the role and power of the peasant following the massive reduction in England's peasant population during the Black Death. I guess it is sometimes hard to find cheery examples in history. Nevertheless, great upheaval occurs when society is forced to adopt a new value system and new narrative of what social roles are valuable. It is certainly very conceivable that with a few changed conditions, we might have seen a very different world indeed. And if you would like to get into that revolutionary spirit, then you really should be taking a look at Gallows Corner, a Peasant's Revolt RPG. It's set in late 14th century England and sees players fomenting their own workers' rebellion, taking the role of a variety of peasants, from thieves to troubadours to tanners or town criers. The Kickstarter by Black Sail Studios is ending soon, so do check it out in the description below. I have actually done some writing on this project as well, because it's really up my street. If it sounds up your street too, do check out those links in the description and pinned comment within the next week. It is a lot of fun. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.